A few weeks ago, we aired our top MOBAs of 2018 video with a mention of a follow-up. As promised, here's part 2 of our series, this time focusing on the least successful MOBAs in recent memory. We'll be looking at MOBAs that have recently shut down or are expected to in the near future. It's worth mentioning that this list is in no particular order. First up is one of the 2 entries on this list I was really hoping would succeed, Hyper Universe. With its unique blend of 2D beat-em-up gameplay and MOBA objective-based matches, Hyper Universe had almost everything it needed to carve out a niche audience. It's also the only one on the list who hasn't announced an official closing yet, but with a massively dwindling player base and match queue times in excess of 40 minutes, the writing is all over the wall and spilling onto the carpets for this game. So how did it get this way? Well, it's hard to pinpoint an exact single reason. A lot of people argue that it comes down to issues of censorship. A lot of the community on the game's subreddit, when asked, are quick to point out that the game's fan service was its real selling point, and that choosing to limit that damaged the game's overall appeal. Others argue that it was bots, and not just the ones the game makes you play against for the first few account levels. Rates for account levels and acquiring unlocks in Hyper Universe are engineered to be a massive grind. Like most free-to-play games, this is designed to get you spending money. Unfortunately, this inspired players to use bots more than it did to crack their wallets. The game became flooded with bots players had put together to grind out matches with simple AI to earn progress toward unlocks. It got to the point where bots were costing players games, and it drove chunks of the player base away entirely. Steam activity monitoring website Steam Charts maps the average concurrent players in the last 30 days for Hyper Universe at 148 players. Obviously, this doesn't count people who are using the Nexon client, but if it's any indication of how many might still be playing, the game is definitely not long for this world. Gigantic is the other entry on this list that I was hoping would make a real name for itself. It was a strange but satisfying combination of third-person hero shooter and MOBA with a memorable cast of original characters. The game centered around 2 warring giant monsters and their teams of champions, each looking to bring the other down. The game's visual style was stunning, bright, cel-shaded maps with varied environments, tons of color, and lots of personality. The stages also changed along with phases of the game, with new parts of the maps opening up and old ones closing off. Unfortunately, Gigantic was crippled by a series of head-scratching management decisions that led to a decaying player base. Many players on the game's subreddit mentioned the slow update schedule and the focus on new content instead of character balance as major issues, but these can be traced back to an incredibly unfortunate development timeline. Gigantic was entering its first beta phase at a time when Microsoft was in mid-transition from the disastrous Windows 8 and 8.1 to the new Windows 10. Unfortunately, not everyone at the time had access to Windows 10, and the decision was made to open the first beta to Windows 10 users only. Combine this with a party system that only worked a portion of the time, and there's little reason for players who value playing with their friends to stick around. Not long after, Motiga faced massive layoffs, and a fraction of the teams kept on to maintain the game. From there, it was only a matter of time, and in January of this year, Motiga announced that Gigantic will be shutting down for good at the end of July. Next on our list is Paragon, the third-person MOBA from Epic Games. Paragon drew a fair amount of attention when it was announced, pulling in a small but dedicated group of fans. Despite going free-to-play in 2017, the game failed to grow too much beyond its initial following. There wasn't much interest in the competitive scene for Paragon, and with the game's constantly shifting direction, it wasn't too hard to see why. The Monolith update, which overhauled the map and overall game feel, tried to remedy this and tie the game to a more clear vision, but it was too late for Paragon to gain any meaningful traction. The most tangible factor in Paragon's failure, though, is actually the other game Epic began working on alongside Paragon, Fortnite. As Fortnite began to gain traction, and then eventually faced a huge explosion in popularity after the introduction of the PUBG-inspired Battle Royale mode, Epic had to make a difficult decision. Keep the team separated and spend a portion of the company's money and manpower on a game that was failing to grab and retain players, or funnel the Paragon team and their resources over into the smash hit that Fortnite was becoming. Naturally, they decided to focus on Fortnite and capitalize on the newly emerging and still hot Battle Royale genre. In a situation closely mirroring that of Gigantic's predicament, this left Paragon with a minuscule team and a dramatically slowed update schedule. Eventually, as their number of players dwindled further, Epic decided to pull the plug on Paragon and shut down the servers on April 26th of this year. The final game on our list, and arguably the worst of the bunch, is Infinite Crisis. From the beginning, the development and life cycle of Infinite Crisis was a bit of a mess. Turbine, the game's developer, had no real experience with the MOBA genre, and it showed. The game suffered from a lack of variety in characters, which is part of what makes MOBAs fun and keeps people coming back to them. Instead of tapping into the huge array of DC characters available to them, Turbine opted for a ton of different versions of the same few characters, including at least 7 different Batmen, Jokers, and a handful of Supermen. In a thread on Reddit, a former Turbine employee who claimed to be closely related to the Infinite Crisis team mentioned that despite all the money and manpower Turbine was dumping into the game, they were drawing average concurrent player numbers of less than 1,000 people. Infinite Crisis was also notoriously imbalanced, with the same overpowered characters going unchecked for long stretches of time. It also featured a number of bugs and sound issues, as well as incredibly dated visuals when compared to its contemporaries. Turbine's inexperience, poor community management, and bad design choices were a huge part of why the game failed to compete with the already supermassive Dota 2 and League of Legends. From there, it's more or less the same story as the other games on this list, except with a much poorer base game at the heart of the story. The single thread that ties all of these games' failures together is the inability to gather and retain players. Even games like Gigantic, that had all the potential in the world, were launching into a genre that had already been established and dominated by 1 or 2 games for a decade or more already. From there, the MOBA bubble grew as more and more studios rushed to try and cash in on the success of genre titans like League and Dota. As the Battle Royale genre continues to grow in popularity, it looks like history may be well repeating itself. Radical Heights has already both started and shut down in a period of less than 6 months, and the Battle Royale genre is still relatively young. Who knows? Maybe in a few years we'll be having the same discussion about successful and failed Battle Royale games. Well, that's it for our list. For more on MOBAs and all your other favorite online games, keep it locked on MMOHuts.com.